Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Just before we get started, I'm just going to run through a few Zoom tips for today's webinar. So you'll notice that we're using a Zoom webinar, which is a little bit different than a typical Zoom meeting. So I just want to review the two options for engagement because we're hoping to have a lot of engagement from you folks today. So you'll see on the right-hand side, there is the question box, which you can see looks like the little picture in the top of the slide. And that's where we want you to put any questions that you have for our presenters or our moderator. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see the chat box. And this is where we want to hear any thoughts that you have about the webinar, any experiences that you want to share. And you can start by sharing where you're joining from and your name. And one more thing to note in the chat box is when you open it up, you'll see a little blue button at the top where it says to, and it says to all panelists. We want you to click that and select to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your comments and your name. And last but not least, if you have anything, any questions or require any tech support, you can reach out to myself at Megan, MEGHAN @wellingtonwaterwatchers.ca, and I can help you over email. All right, everybody. Now I'm going to pass it over to Karen. We're super lucky to have Karen moderate our webinar today. Over to you, Karen.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Sorry, folks, it'll just be a moment getting the sound working for everybody.
My name is Karen Rathwell. I'm a member of the board of Wellington Water Watchers, and I'll be your host today for our next webinar called Getting Smarter About Salt. Salt, you say? In September? Isn't this a little premature? We're still dealing from the repercussions from last year's salt application. This webinar is one small piece of a larger campaign, the People's Water Campaign, where Wellington Water Watchers is collecting water issues from across Ontario. We will be hosting a culminating celebratory event on Saturday, September 26th, called Watershed 2020, working towards a water justice agenda. I hope you all will be able to join us for that. I have 4 very special people today waiting in the wings. They come to us through their computers from an area spanning half of Ontario. And this land, all ancestral land of many First Nations. It is with great appreciation I would like to acknowledge the contributions of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Métis people, as they were stewards of this land and water for thousands of years before it was colonized. And as we do our learning today, let us do it with gratitude and humility, that we might raise the water stewardship bar to a standard that has been lost to us for far too long. Our panelists are passionate about salt, and this passion is infectious. Today you will meet Bill Thompson from Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority, where they have become leaders in the province with their strategy of partnerships on salt management. Shelley Arnott, a professor of aquatic ecology at Queen's University, who is studying concentrations of chloride in our freshwater lakes and the impact this chloride has on freshwater creatures. We'll be hearing from Lee Gould, who comes from a not-for-profit organization called Smart About Salt, who has kept this issue on the front burner for years. At Smart About Salt, there is training for property management people and snow removal businesses so they can be better stewards of their salt application. And our fourth speaker, Kelsey Scarfone from Environmental Defense, who will talk about the political things that are being explored in Ontario regarding salt management. It is our hope that by the end of this webinar, our listeners will have a better understanding of the downside of winter salt use, and also come away with many ideas about how each one of us can make a difference and minimize the amount of damage that we're currently making. Now allow me to introduce Bill Thompson from Lake Simcoe and Region Conservation Authority to talk about the extensive work that's being done in this region. Take it away, Bill.
Thanks, Karen. So my name is Bill Thompson. I work with Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing to try to reduce the amount of salt used in our watershed, and a little bit about why we care about this as an environmental issue. First, though, a little bit about salt itself. It's a very simple chemical. It's just the same salt that you use on your French fries and in your kitchen is the same salt that goes on roads and parking lots. It's just sodium chloride, 1 part sodium, 1 part chloride. And its life in the environment is just as simple as its chemical composition. What happens is you put salt on the road, it gets wet, it dissolves. The sodium goes one way, the chloride goes the other way, and that's really about it. It stays in solution, and it moves very rapidly through the environment. There's no plant that takes it up. It doesn't bind to soil. It really stays mobile in the environment. Unfortunately, though, it means that every molecule, every grain of salt you put on the landscape does ultimately find its way into lakes or rivers or groundwater. And unfortunately, along the path, it does have a number of negative environmental impacts. Everything from making roads more attractive to wildlife that come and lick up the salt off the road and therefore increasing the number of roadkills, to damage you may have seen to trees and other vegetation along roads. And then ultimately, as it gets into those water courses, it becomes a pretty significant stressor for freshwater organisms living there. And that's really where we as a conservation authority become interested. One of the later panelists is going to talk about this in more detail. What I have on my slide is a reference to osmoregulation, which just means it makes it more difficult for these freshwater organisms to breathe as the water gets saltier and saltier. Ultimately, though, there is no best practice that will take salt out of the environment. The best practice has to be applied at the point the salt itself is applied. So why we care as a conservation authority is because of this graph. This is a graph of trends in chloride concentration in Lake Simcoe over the past 50 years. This is the period of record that we've been tracking this particular contaminant in the lake, and you can see over that time it's increased consistently. And in fact, it's increased by a factor of 5 since 1970. The good news, if there is good news, is that it's still well below the federal guideline. The federal government has set a guideline for chloride of 120 milligrams per liter. We're currently sitting at just around 50. So we're not at a point yet that we think there's significant impacts to the lake ecosystem, but we're clearly trending in the wrong direction. And as you'll hear from a later panelist, more recent research suggests that at least in some environments, 120 milligrams may be in fact too high as a standard. So in fact, we may have a greater concern here than we even realized. But based on that and based on the trend, we did a number of years ago set out to develop a salt reduction strategy for our watershed to try to address this trend and try to reduce the amount of salt going into Lake Simcoe. And we started out this with a bit of a back of the envelope calculation of the amount of salt that gets put down on roads and parking lots in our watershed. And so we did a survey of roads managers provincially and locally to get a sense of who is using what and how much. And we had a pre-existing survey of parking lot managers that we could take advantage of. And when we summed that up across our watershed, we found that in the preceding winter, which was winter 2011, 2012, there was 100,000 tons of salt put on our watershed. And that was really the first lesson for us, is just the sheer volume of salt being used in this area. I don't think we're atypical. We are Central Ontario, though. It is certainly a winter area. But to put this into context, 100,000 tons, that's the same weight of the CN Tower, right? So we're putting a CN Tower's worth of salt in Lake Simcoe every year. And that helps to explain that trend you saw in the graph a moment ago. To put that in another context, on a per person basis, that's about 225 kilograms of salt per person, or kind of 2.5 times my body weight, keeping me safe on roads and parking lots in the winter. So it's a substantial amount of salt being used. The second lesson for us was, when you break it down on a kind of a sector by sector basis, there's no one sector that's the primary source of the salt. And so there's no kind of one silver bullet that will solve this problem. The source of the salt really is a combination of provincial highways, regional or county roads, municipal roads, and parking lots. So the reduction strategy we have focuses on both the public sector, those managing the roads, and the private sector, those managing parking lots. On the roads, it was a fairly easy conversation to start, largely because for a number of years now, Environment Canada has had a code of practice out, which most municipalities across Canada have adopted. And the code of practice is around the environmental management of road salt. And the code of practice has a number of best practices within it that it recommends, and many municipalities have adopted some of those best practices. In our watershed, we have a mix of large, arguably well-resourced municipalities, and small and rapidly growing municipalities who are a little more stretched for resources. So we wanted to make sure that the adoption of best practices was as extensive as possible, given the range of resources available. We did find, however, in talking to roads managers, that everyone was trying something, typically on every year, a new material or a new application rate to try to improve their practices. Unfortunately, though, we did find that people were often reinventing the wheel and running a pilot in this municipality that their neighboring municipality had done, 1 or 2 years previously. So in order to try to increase the range of adoption of some of these best practices and perhaps have people learn from each other's pilot studies, we set up a SALT working group in our watershed that brought in roads managers from some of the large, the urban, and the rapidly urbanizing municipalities, as well as their land use planning staff and their source protection staff, to talk about road salt, to talk about the challenge between balancing public safety and environmental protection, but more importantly, to talk about the pilot studies they had all been trying out to try to improve their practices and to give them a venue or a platform to share with their peers. We'd also talk about some of the environmental trends we were seeing in the lake and in its tributaries, and we would capture some of these conversations in a series of short technical briefs like the one shown on the slide here that describes a little bit some of the pilot studies that people had undertaken, and we went into some of the literature to describe some of the pros and cons of various alternatives. And this is now a resource we can share with roads departments in our watershed and beyond. And in fact, we can see that the progress is possible in the municipal field. This is one municipality in our watershed. I won't name who because the data is still kind of in process. But they provided us data back to 1995 of the amount of salt they used per event per kilometer of road. And that's shown in the bars on this slide here. And what happened was in 2015, they shifted from using a conventional rock salt to a treated salt, which is the kind of bluish material shown in the photo here. And this material, it's more sophisticated, it's slightly more expensive, but it does work at a colder temperature, and it is slightly stickier, so it doesn't tend to bounce off pavement the way that, or as much as a conventional salt will. And so we can see from the data that they've been able to reduce their application rates by 50% by shifting from the conventional material to this more modern, more sophisticated material. And this is phenomenal, right? This is exactly what we wanted to see happen. We're hoping that we can convince other municipalities to adopt this shift as well. The challenge, again, though, it is a slightly more expensive material. So councils, senior management, particularly those maybe a little more distant from the day-to-day of roads management, are hesitant about the additional upfront costs associated with this material. So we're hoping now that we have data like this, we can take back to those decision makers and say, yes, you may be paying 10 or even 20% more per ton of material, but you can use 50% less of it. Therefore, you're going to save money at the end of the day. This municipality also has provided us some information on the fuel their trucks are using. And when they made that shift, they've also reduced their fuel usage by 30%. So again, saving money, less environmental footprint from a carbon standpoint this time. So it's a win-win. What we're looking at now, and I'm confident we can show that it provides as much safety on the roads as well. We're not seeing a change in the number of accidents. So I think this is a classic case of a triple bottom line, a win-win-win. This shift, it's good for the pocketbook, it's good for the environment, and it's good for public safety. So we're trying to now disseminate this information back to other municipalities who haven't made this shift to make the case that this is something that's it's a low-hanging fruit you can do and have a significant impact on the health of your local watershed. The private sector is a different, it's been a different conversation. It's not perhaps as easy or as quick to start. The drivers and barriers in the private sector are different than in the public sector, and the level of understanding of the environmental impacts of salt is different as well, largely because the code of practice, the federal code of practice doesn't apply to the private sector. That has been changing in recent years, though, due in large part to the good work of the Smart About Salt Council. Another panelist will speak about this council later. We have been partnering with them in our watershed, though, for a number of years to provide training to contractors and property managers. We haven't, however, seen the rapid uptake of these best practices we were expecting to, and largely we've heard from contractors it's because their clients aren't demanding that level of service. So we, again, set up another venue for conversation, which we call a freshwater roundtable. And at this roundtable, contractors, industry associations, as well as some of their large clients, big box stores, REITs, their industry associations, as well as environmental groups and representatives from various levels of government. Again, a venue to talk about winter maintenance and environmental impacts, some of the best practices available, and some of the barriers to adopting those best practices. We have with them developed a discussion paper describing these challenges as well as their solutions. And we're hoping now to phase into working on some business cases like the one I showed on the municipal side to show to parking lot managers, yes, you can adopt some of these new practices, keep your property as safe, reduce your operational costs, and perhaps reduce your damage to your infrastructure as well. I think there is a bottom line case can be made here. The challenge, however, for these folks primarily is one of liability. Contractors particularly tend to be small businesses, and they're very concerned that they will lose their business if they change their practices. So we're doing what we can to help them understand the liability and the public safety implications of the various alternatives. But I think ultimately there's more here that a conservation authority or industry can do. And I think this is something that the government may need to step in and change the law to provide a little more clarity around liability, winter maintenance, and the use of salt. Finally, though, in our watershed, and I suspect for many of you where you live as well, one of the top of mind items for us is the amount of growth and development happening. And so, for example, this is a map of our watershed showing existing urban areas in gray and projected future areas in purple. So lots of growth and development happening. We are, of course, on the northern edge of the GTA, lots of people moving out of the city and the more urban areas into the slightly more rural areas in our watershed. And we anticipate our population to grow by about 50% over the next 20 years. So unfortunately, what this means is all the great gains we can achieve through best practices could be offset with another kilometer of road or another hectare of parking lot in a big box store. So we need to think about designing and building new communities in a way that's different than how we have done in the past and design with winter maintenance in mind. So with that, we've been working with the provincial government for the past few years to develop and disseminate some guidelines for new parking lot design that takes winter maintenance into consideration during the design phase. The thought is that there's a few concepts that can be adopted during construction relatively inexpensively to reduce the effort needed to maintain sites during winter, reduce the amount of salt needed, and ultimately reduce the cost to the folks managing and owning these properties. So there are some design briefs around some of the concepts related to proper grading of the site and sloping on the site, to the design and location of snow disposal sites and transportation pathways or particularly pathways for pedestrians to make sure you're not oversalting areas that aren't actually being used. In addition to design briefs, we have examples of how these can be applied in small, medium, and large sites. And now we have some template municipal policies for municipalities who may want to adopt these in their official plans or in their green development standards and make them mandatory in their watersheds or in their municipalities rather. So this is a big challenge. As you saw from that graph, there's a lot of salt going into our watershed. It's a long-term trend. It's not going to be an easy solution. I don't think there's a silver bullet solution, but I do think we're starting to see some progress on this item. I think very positive changes in our municipalities, very positive conversations in the private sector as well. I'll leave the presentation there, though, in the interest of time, but we'll say that many of these resources are available on either of these websites, and my contact information is on this slide as well. Thank you very much.
Bill, thank you. What amazing work is being done already in Ontario. It's terrific. Thank you for your leadership at Lake Simcoe and Region Conservation Authority.
Yeah, thank you.
This freshwater roundtable, what an excellent idea. So many parties coming together to get a handle on this issue.
Yeah, it's been very interesting because I think in the early days, people didn't, on the private sector, didn't want to think about it. They've already got a lot of environmental things worrying about climate change and pollutants, but they're starting to see it hit their pocketbook as well. It's becoming more difficult for contractors to get insurance. So their cost to their clients is going up, and so the clients are starting to pay attention. I think we're starting to get to the point where they realize, yeah, this is an issue we need to do something about. So
wonderful.
We're at a very interesting point in this conversation, I think.
Yes, and we haven't reached a tipping point. We can get in front of this one problem if we all do our part.
100%, yeah.
If our listeners have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. There will be time to address some of these questions at the end of all of the presentations. And now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Shelley Arnott from Queen's University in Kingston. Shelley runs the Arnott Aquatic Ecology Lab, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her work. Take it away, Shelley.
Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking to you about some research that my lab has been doing to examine the effects of road salt on freshwater zooplankton communities. In Canada, we're very fortunate to live in a country that is rich in freshwater resources. In fact, 20% of the world's freshwater is in Canada. And this water provides a number of important services, including drinking water, generating hydroelectricity, irrigation, and various forms of recreation. Despite the importance of water, lakes and streams are facing many challenges associated with nutrient loading, climate change, pollution, invasive species, and habitat alteration. And one issue that's recently emerged as a concern is that chloride concentration is increasing in lakes and streams across North America. So here's an example from Lake Simcoe, and what you can see is that through time, since the 1970s, the chloride concentrations have been steadily increasing. And in fact, now the concentration is up to about 52 milligrams of chloride per liter. Now this pattern is also common across lakes in North America, particularly those that are located near roads and urban areas where salt is applied. Now the reason for this increase in chloride is that we apply up to 7 million tons of sodium chloride, which is road salt, to roads and parking lots each year in Canada. And that's equivalent to about 500,000 salt trucks full. This salt eventually makes its way from the roads to waterways. And so should we be concerned about this? Well, the short answer is yes. There certainly are ecological impacts. In lakes and streams, we lose sensitive species, especially small invertebrate species like zooplankton. And this can result in the loss of ecosystem services that we value. So for example, increased salinity has been associated with increased algal production, and it can also impair our drinking water by making it too salty to drink. Now, of course, in Canada and other places, chloride is recognized as a toxin. And so therefore we have water quality guidelines that are aimed to protect aquatic life. The Canadian water quality guidelines set the chronic exposure limit to 120 milligrams of chloride per liter. So that's the long-term exposure. For short-term exposure, or acute exposure, it's set at 640 milligrams per liter. So the question is, do these current water quality guidelines protect all of Ontario's lakes? And so this is a graph showing chloride concentrations in Ontario's recreational lakes. And the green and the blue are relatively low chloride concentrations. So the green indicates chloride concentrations that are less than 5 milligrams per liter. The blue is 5 to 40 milligrams, and the orange and red are 40 to 120 and above 120. And so you can see most of the recreational lakes in Ontario fall below 40 milligrams per liter. So you might think this means that the aquatic life is protected by the guidelines, but I'm going to show you some results of our studies that indicate that these guidelines might not be adequate in all lakes. And I'm going to show you results from some lab experiments, from some field mesocosm experiments that we've done, as well as global experiment that we did in collaboration with 16 other sites across the world. And finally, I'll show you some historical changes that have occurred in a fairly salty lake in Muskoka. But first, I'm going to talk about how water quality guidelines are determined. And the way that this is done is using laboratory tests on individual species, such as this Daphnia shown in the picture. And what they do in the lab is they expose Daphnia to different concentrations of chloride or whatever toxin they're interested in. And then they monitor some response, like survival or maybe reproduction. And then they look at what dose that you see either no effect or a very low effect. So say a 10 or 25% decrease in reproduction. And then that number is then used in conjunction with this similar test done on a whole bunch of other species. So in this case, for the Canadian Water Quality Guidelines, they used 28 different species of fish, amphibians, invertebrates, and plants. And they lined them up according to their sensitivity. So the ones on the right are the least sensitive, so they're able to tolerate very high concentrations of chloride. And the ones on the left are the most sensitive. Using this graph, they set the water quality guidelines so that it protected 95% of the species tested. And that 95% point is 120 milligrams of chloride per liter. And so what this means is that most species should be protected if the water quality if the chloride concentration in the lake is below 120. Okay, so why are we questioning the guidelines? That seems like a pretty good method for determining toxicity. Well, two reasons. One is that the species tested are not necessarily those that are commonly found in lakes in Ontario. The second reason is that toxicity can vary depending on how hard the water is or how much calcium is in the water. And so in a place like southern Ontario where the water is fairly hard because the bedrock is limestone, then the toxicity might be a little bit less than in lakes where the water is quite soft, like up on the Canadian Shield. We tested these ideas using zooplankton. So they're an important component of aquatic food webs. They graze phytoplankton and transfer that energy up to higher trophic levels like fish. So to test the suitability of the water quality guidelines, what we did were some lab experiments where we raised zooplankton that were taken from lakes in the Canadian Shield. We raised them at different concentrations of chloride using a soft water medium. And we monitored their survival and reproduction. And so this graph shows the result of that experiment. And what we see on the left is the total number of offspring or babies produced over the 21-day period at the different concentrations of chloride. And so you can see as chloride concentration increases, the number of babies produced decreases. And when we look at the water quality guidelines, we see that across all species, there's a 64% reduction in reproduction at 120 milligrams per liter. And this is particularly bad for a species, Daphnia mendota, which is fairly common in Canadian Shield lakes. And we see 100% reduction at the current water quality guidelines. Now we also see the same thing for mortality. So what this graph is showing is the chloride concentration where 50% of the individuals die. And what you can see is that for all the species that we tested, over half of them die below the current Canadian water quality guidelines. So this is really suggesting that the current water quality guidelines are not protecting zooplankton in Canadian Shield lakes. And we saw this through both the reduced reproduction and reduced survival at low concentrations of chloride. But these are lab experiments, and there are some drawbacks to lab experiments. They've been reared in the lab, so they're used to those conditions. It's not, laboratory conditions are very controlled, so it's very different from lake conditions. And the environmental context is very simple. There aren't any predators or competitors to deal with. And so what we did was we conducted some similar experiments out in the field using these field mesocosms. So there were 2 studies done, one by Daniel Greco, a master's student in my lab, and the other by Alex McClymont, also a master's student. And so they set up 30 of these mesocosms and had a gradient of chloride that went from the ambient concentration, so less than 5, to all the way up to 1,500 milligrams of chloride per liter. And then they looked at the zooplankton response after 6 weeks. So this graph is showing for both experiments, one in Long Lake and one in Paint Lake, the reduction in cladocerin abundance as chloride increases. So cladocerins are the zooplankton that graze algae. And what we see in both cases, as chloride increases, there's a dramatic decrease in the abundance of those cladocerins. So for Long Lake, at the current water quality guidelines, they were reduced by 62%, and in Paint Lake, they were reduced by almost 50%. So this is large reductions below the current water quality guidelines. Now, of course, this is just in 2 lakes in Ontario, so we wanted to compare the response across a broader geographic region. So we collaborated with researchers from 16 different sites, and we all did the same experiment. And this graph is showing the cladocerin LC50. So what that is the chloride concentration where the half of the cladocerins are lost. And so what you can see in the red dots represent experiments where the LC50, so that half of the cladocerins were lost, within the range of the water quality guidelines, either in Canada, shown by the solid line, or in the US, shown by the dashed line. And there were 4 sites, 2 of them actually in Sweden, where they were less sensitive. And so what this tells us is that there's some variation globally in the sensitivity among sites, but that cladocerins at most sites in Canada and the US were highly vulnerable to chloride, even at concentrations below the current water quality guidelines. Okay, so that's all well and good, but do we actually see evidence of this in lakes? And to address that, we looked at community change in Jevons Lake, which is a lake that's located near Highway 11, near Gravenhurst in Muskoka. And what we did was take a sediment core from the lake. And when organisms die, they drift down to the bottom of the lake. And so what you get in the sediment core is this record through time of fossils of organisms that lived in the lake. And so in this case, we're looking at the cladocerins, and we're seeing whether the community composition has changed. And so this graph summarizes the community composition through time. So points that are close together indicate communities that are very similar to each other, and as points get further away, the community is getting a lot more different. And so what you can see here is that through time, the cladocerin community composition was very stable until we started applying road salt around the 1940s or 50s. And what we see, as indicated by this red line, is that as soon as we started applying road salt, the community started to diverge. And so what this suggests is that the current water quality guidelines don't protect zooplankton in all lakes. And we showed this through laboratory experiments with multiple Daphnia species and populations, with field experiments in multiple lakes, both within Ontario and across the US and in Europe. And we also looked at the historical reconstruction of cladocerin communities and showed that there was a change in community composition that coincided with the application of road salt. And so what we are advocating is that we need to change the water quality guidelines so that they're more adequately protecting all lakes in Ontario. So thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Shelley. Clearly, the work that you've been doing at Queen's is sending us a message that we can't be so cavalier about our winter salt use anymore. We're really feeling it. Our next guest, Lee Gould, is part of a not-for-profit. It's an organization that has taken on this issue in partnership with a number of different organizations. Welcome, Lee. The stage is yours.
Hello, my name is Lee Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Smart About Salt Council. I'm thrilled to have been invited today to give you a bit of background on the Smart About Salt, a primer on the salt challenge itself, how the Smart About Salt and Council and others are responding to try and find solutions, and we'll wind up providing you with contact information should you have questions or wish further information. So the Smart About Salt itself, Council, is a registered not-for-profit organization incubated by both municipal level government and industry. To be more specific, the region of Waterloo and Landscape Ontario, the trade association based in Milton, understood the problem as far back as the early 2000s and created Smart About Salt in 2009 with a mission to protect fresh water from winter salt applied on facilities. And when we talk about salt, we're talking about chlorides or de-icing media. For this presentation, those terms or names can be synonymous. The Smart About Salt's vision is very much around professionally designed and managed facilities that promote safety and ultimately reduce the amount of salt that is needed to achieve that outcome. We offer award-winning training that certainly improves winter maintenance practices, and we recognize industry leaders and their professionalism through our certification programs. Salt Insights. Just a little bit about background on the challenge itself. We know from studies that poor winter maintenance practices represent a profound and increasing environment and human health challenge. With more roads being built, more houses being built, there's obviously a need to maintain safety, and so the amount of product that goes down, the amount of winter maintenance activity goes up, and so the chlorides that are entering the environment likewise. When we talk about salt, typically in winter maintenance, we often are referring to sodium chloride or simple rock salt. There are other products, magnesium chlorides and calcium chlorides and whatnot. These are the lower freezing points and so are used at lower temperatures. But at the end of the day, the chloride or the salt itself cannot be removed from the environment, and so that becomes the biggest problem. We often think of roads when we're talking about winter maintenance, but we also need to focus on parking lots and sidewalks, who are at least 50% of the salt that's applied as a result of. I included this slide because it gives a pretty powerful, I think, understanding of how the problem continues to grow and to magnify. The Credit Valley Conservation Authority regularly conducts salinity studies on the watercourses in their jurisdiction, and this particular example shows the Credit River at some points of the year in 2014 had salinity that was well above that that you would see in seawater. And there's even evidence that a population of saltwater crabs was living quite happily at some point in one of the rivers or creeks that feed into Lake Ontario. The challenge surrounding winter maintenance operations are magnifying business concern, which we should all be concerned with. The slip and fall concerns and have manifested themselves in insurance claims, which are passed on to facility owners and contractors alike. It makes it much more expensive to deliver the service that is necessary for business to run. And so without these folks, we don't see businesses open, and so we should all be concerned about the This is perhaps, I think, the biggest concern around winter maintenance is the lack of understanding around the liability and also the understanding around safety as it pertains to winter maintenance operations. Collectively, though, there are many stakeholders that are working to understand and meaningfully address the issue. Many of them are working on a variety of studies and whatnot to try and get a handle on what is exactly happening. Many of those folks are here today and will provide you with So I spoke about providing you with a background on our on Smart About Salt and how we're seeking to address the problem. Well, training is one of those efforts. We want folks, and we understand that folks that practice the best management understandings of how to undertake winter maintenance see a much better outcome, both in terms of safety, but in a reduction of salt. So we offer a number of award-winning transnational training opportunities. The big one is our Essentials of Salt Management course, considered a basic Salt 101, if you will, but also a refresher course for certified professionals. We are unique in that we offer training both online and in person, although because of COVID concerns we haven't been doing that since March. But certainly online training in both English and French is available for winter maintenance contractors, facility owners, operators, municipal employees, anyone who has an interest in winter maintenance practices is able and invited to take our training course. The training itself focuses on best management practices. It helps folks to understand how to reduce their costs associated with maintenance practices. If people practice what we are trying to preach, I suppose, with good record keeping and undertaking the right actions at the right times, then they do. The training itself does offer a due diligence defense. Through training and certification, certainly we can assist contractors and others in defining themselves as professionals ahead of the herd, if you will, and certainly help reduce the impacts of salt on infrastructure, improve client and customer relations. After all, if we're promoting safety and people aren't slipping as they're entering a business, then of course they're much better customers or clients. And of course, as we started, our mission is focused on fresh water and the environment, so we certainly support the environment and drinking water resources. I won't spend a lot of time on the next few slides. I just wanted to give you a sense of what subject matter is covered in the training. There's 13 actual teaching modules, followed by a summary, and then we provide an exam. We cover everything from salt through to mechanical snow removal, how liquids can be used for anti-icing and de-icing calibration, very important, because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Record keeping, as I said, and very important to manage against legal liability. Site assessment, and as I say, everyone that provides spends time with the course is asked to undertake an exam. Once passed, and typically folks pass quite readily. The average score, I think, right now is about 93%. The course itself can be done in a day. If you're doing it in person, we typically run it from 8:30 to 4:30. The cost of the course is $375. And to complete, we give you a certificate and also register you in our publicly accessible database. So those that are looking to hire the very best professionals, trained people, can find those on our website. It is the training that sort of is foundational to our certification program. This can be achieved quickly and simply online. We ask that it's undertaken annually. There is a cost. We might be a not-for-profit, but it does cost money to keep the lights on. So there is a small cost of $250 annually. We ask for 5 different variables when folks file their annual certification. We ask them to tell us how much parking lot is serviced, how much sidewalk area is serviced, the amount of salt they put down, them to give us a sense of the storm events that they reacted to, and then make a calculation, which frankly we verify, that calculates how much product is going down over what area per event. The training itself is good for 5 years, and after that time, folks will have to renew. We revisit the training every year to make sure it's well aligned with the leading thinking of the day. This slide just captures the process. You complete the training, as I've said. You can go online and register an intent to certify, and then you file an annual renewal, and you keep current with your training. Quite simple. Like training, we provide certification because it's often requested as a part of the tender process, so certificates are provided, and those can be included with responses to fairly new and certainly unique to Smart About Salt is our activities around program verification, also called auditing. We actually will ask you to validate from time to time the data that you're providing, the amount of salt you're putting down, for instance, and we'll even go out and do spot audits from time to time based on feedback from the public and others. It is not designed to be an adversarial process. We don't use this at the moment to strip anyone of certification. It's used as a coaching tool with those that are certified, and also as a feedback mechanism for ourselves to make sure that what we're trying to impart is actually being used and is useful to those that are actually having to put it into practice. The Smart About Salt has deployed the program verification, but it's free. It's unlike the training, which is $375, or the certification, which is $250. The verification is free, and as I say, does not result in removal or cancellation of any certification. Again, a quick summary: you complete your annual certification review. We may request additional documentation around your salt purchases, so purchase orders would be typical. We communicate the results of any audit, and from time to time conduct a site. So just wrapping up, current winter maintenance practices and urbanization directly correlate to increasing chloride levels. There's no doubt about this. Winter maintenance contractors and others are struggling with the ability to gain and pay for insurance, which is in turn has challenged the procurement efforts for facility owners and operators. Quite simply, what that means is that we should all be interested in this, not just because the environment is being negatively impacted, but because this is a legitimate business concern that could have economic consequences for us all. Clearly, I would hope throughout this presentation you've heard me talk about safety, that's where we start the conversations. It is safety first, but we understand that a poor understanding of liability promotes poor winter maintenance habits. Smart About Salt is but one of a number of groups who are actively trying to tackle this problem. Some jurisdictions like New Hampshire and Illinois have brought legislative remedies to bear that see contractors that can demonstrate that they're trained and applying best practices are indemnified from slip and fall claims that don't meet the gross negligence bar. Certainly those sorts of conversations are ongoing here in Ontario, and we hope to see them come to some sort of fruition in the not so distant future. Wrapping up, thank you. If anyone has any questions or would like more information, feel free to reach out. I can always be reached at lee.gould@smartaboutsalt.com. Thank you.
Wow, that's a lot to absorb. Thank you, Lee. Lee's not able to be here with us today for the live broadcast, but certainly you can reach him at Smart About Salt. There are so many things to think about, and I think what I'm getting from this is reminding myself that some people believe that the more salt you put down, the safer you are, not just on some, but the more you put down is better. And so today we are learning that that is not the case. Thank you, Lee. I'd like to introduce Kelsey Scarfone. She works with not-for-profit environmental defense, and she comes to us today to talk a little bit more about what's happening in Ontario with regard to changing some of the politics and the policies that are happening about this. Kelsey, welcome.
Thank you so much, Karen. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here today. Thanks so much for hosting this great event. Yeah, my name is Kelsey. I'm calling in this morning from Robinson, Huron Treaty Territory of the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabe, or known as Sudbury. And so it's great to be here. I'm going to be super fast because I know you've all been a very patient audience listening to tons of information and taking it in. But like Karen said, I work with environmental defense, and we're focused sort of on the change making aspect of this issue, kind of really targeting public will for some change into the provincial government. And so I actually wanted to start just by sharing a slide here. And it's some data that Lee made use of in his presentation as well. And this is from the Credit River Conservation Authority, Credit Valley Conservation Authority, and they have these live monitoring stations all over their watershed that'll show you how much chloride is sort of in that stream at any given point in the winter. So this is just over the course of a couple of days last winter, and Shelley's conversation around guidelines. And we are asking the province to set a provincial water quality objective for chloride and salt, which would recognize, some of the evidence that Shelley was sharing is that the federal guidelines are not keeping species, particularly species at risk, safe from chloride. It's not at the appropriate level to sort of be commensurate with the risk that we're seeing to species. So that's sort of step one. And from our perspective, that's a pretty low bar and something that's very achievable for the government to do. It's something their ministry can get moving without a lot of political sort of involvement. It's something the department can get started on working on. And we have reason to believe that there's, some movement on that. In the draft Canada-Ontario Agreement for the Great Lakes, there was some language around setting a more specific target that better reflects the risk to aquatic life in Ontario. And so that language we interpreted as kind of getting closer to our goal. Another kind of opportunity is that right now there's some drinking water regulations that are being proposed and are under review, and there's some language in there about looking at the risk that road salt might pose to those drinking water, reducing their salt use. We've been able to see real reductions without risking public safety. So we're looking for the same type of trend in the private sector. In those applications. So following Less Salty, you can see a lot of the work that's being done throughout the winter. And I think, just being mindful for time here, I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelsey. That was fast. If you do have questions, be sure to look down at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, because I see there are some questions lined up there. And it is good to understand that the fear of liability is one of the driving forces for this whole problem. And so if we can reduce that by, as citizens, wearing our boots and making sure that if we fall, we've got a hat on so we don't hit our head, and just making sure that we're accompanying people that do have balance problems so that people don't slip and fall, we could actually reduce some of the mountain of salt I often see outside of office buildings, doctors' buildings, and so on in Guelph, where you have to crunch through salt just to get into the front door. We don't need to have that. We just need to think a little smarter. So with regard to all of that we've got happening in the chat box, and some of these questions have been answered, but because people may have missed them, could you comment, Bill, Shelley, about the beet juice, because that is an interesting thing, and I know they are using it out west, and just to understand better if that's a better option, or does it just create other problems? Who wants to go first? Shelley?
Okay, so I think that's a great question, and I think one of the big advantages of using these salt alternatives is that they do have some chloride associated with them, but it's either there's either less chloride in them or you apply less. So that ultimately is a good thing. There's been a few studies that have started to look at their toxic effects, and overall, they don't seem, I hesitate to say anything too strongly because I think we still need more tests, but they don't seem as toxic as road salt. But one of the concerns is like with things like beet juice, and I mentioned this in the chat, was that it has other compounds associated with it, like sugar. And so when sugar gets into water, it can stimulate production. And so it's not so much being toxic, but it's maybe stimulating, bacterial and algal production. But I think we need more studies to look at that.
And if I could just add to that, I have a colleague who's doing her master's degree at Ryerson University looking at parking lot applications of salt. And one of the things she's looking at is beet juice. And what she's found in the parking lots that she's been monitoring so far is that parking lots that have beet juice applied to them have, in fact, potassium associated with the beet juice is going on the parking lot and therefore into the receiving water body. We don't typically think of potassium when we're thinking about environmental contaminants, but it has been shown to have toxicity effects to mussels. So depending on where you are in Ontario, particularly if you're near the Thames River or the Sydenham River, areas that are very, very important habitat for at-risk mussels, beet juice may not be the right solution for you.
Terrific, thank you. I hope that helps. And I know people can do further research or contact you through your businesses or your employers to be able to get these questions answered. Shelley, there's a question in there a question and answer for you. Did you see it? It's a complicated one about the road salt application in the 50s around Jevons Lake from the impacts of climate change. Can you separate those two influences?
Yeah, that's a great question because, of course, there's so many different things that are influencing lakes, and ultimately, climate change is having an impact. And so one of the ways to try to tease that apart is to look at lakes that we wouldn't expect to be influenced by road salt. And so in this particular study, it was a PhD student, Robin Bello, that did it. And so she looked at Jevons Lake, which was right near a highway, and she also compared changes to a lake, Heaney Lake, that doesn't have a winter maintained road. So we wouldn't expect it to be influenced by road salt. And so when we compare the changes in those two lakes, so Heaney Lake, you would expect to be influenced by climate change, and likewise Jevons Lake. But we didn't see any changes in Heaney Lake. So based on that, kind of the difference is that Jevons received road salt and Heaney didn't. The other thing is that when you look at what organisms are influenced by salt, those are the ones that were responding in Jevons Lake. So kind of like by weight of evidence, we think that it was driven by road salt. But that's a great question.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Michael, for putting that on. And I just want to say one thing I learned in conversation with Lee some time ago, and since he's not able here with us today to add this, just to say he was going to, it does come down to money, ultimately, how much a municipality has. And if road salt is cheaper than beet juice or this special blue stuff, that may influence their decision on what they use. And I understand because of the desalination process used to get fresh drinking water in the southwest US, there's going to be an accumulation of salt produced because it's the byproduct of cleaning ocean water to make it potable. And there's going to be a lot of people that are looking for homes for this salt. And so the price of salt may go down considerably over the next couple of decades. And this may be a problem for us in that it will be way cheaper to put salt on our roads than on any other product. So does anyone have a comment about the future as far as that goes? Tom, what do you think? Or Bill, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because you're right. The finances are inevitably part of the decision process for any municipality, any business, and it's so hard to predict change in cost over time. We did see last year, there was a salt shortage. And people were paying twice as much or 4 times as much for salt because it was being shipped in from Egypt and other kind of foreign ports rather than being produced in Ontario. And we did see that led to reduction in salt use, not surprisingly. So that begs the question then, if Lee's right and over time it becomes cheaper, will that make it easier for a greater application of salt? I don't know, but I think that's another argument to get in front of the issue, to change the laws as Kelsey was describing, to increase the training and awareness that Lee was talking about so that it becomes less attractive when that option or if that option pops up.
Yeah.
And if I could just add a little bit, I think one of the things when we think about the cost of salt is that we really have to take into account the cost on the environment. And, you know, I presented information about zooplankton, but there's other kind of, you know, downstream effects or indirect effects by decreasing zooplankton. All studies have also shown that it increases algal blooms or the abundance of algae, and so those might even have cost to communities if the water quality is decreasing. It could, you know, decrease tourism or, you know, decrease drinking water quality. And so I think those kinds of costs are very real and have to be considered when you're thinking about, you know, what the cost of road salt.
Absolutely. And there were comments made, are we willing to sacrifice our flora and fauna so that we might not slip? No, we've got to take personal responsibility. Kelsey, did you want to add to that?
No, I couldn't agree more, right? And it's the entire ecosystems, and from what I gather, Shelley, we're just starting to understand how some of these things interact, and there could be a lot more consequences that we don't fully understand yet. And I think the thing I want to talk a little bit about is just how much room there is for reduction. And so, you know, we spend a lot of time considering alternatives, and there's, you know, some excitement around that aspect of the issue, but there's so much room to reduce what we're applying. And so as a consumer, you know, if we want to talk about the economics of it, something that I try to do as a consumer is have a conversation with storefronts that are, you know, we know those applications that are just like an actual clump of salt.
Oh, we may have lost Kelsey with an unstable connection there for a minute.
Oh, I did. Can you hear me okay now?
We got you okay there, Kelsey.
Okay, but yeah, you can just have a sort of a conversation with some of those places that you frequent that are really overdoing it, to build that awareness so that, you know, regardless of the price of salt, people know that their shoppers are not going to appreciate those massive over applications.
So maybe it's up to each of us, not only on our own doorstep, but as we go into office buildings and other places of work, to comment if it's something that I often think the truck has spilt it because it is so thick, and maybe those need to get cleaned up if there's a spill, and rather than the rush job that I understand has to be done because people are up at 4:30 in the morning to get 5 parking lots cleared and they're in a hurry. I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. It's just 10 after 11, but I do want to just close off. If there's a comment any one of my panelists would like to add just before we close. No, we've said it. And then I want to just introduce Megan and Danny Lindemood, Megan Clout, who are our producers today and have led us through this wonderful webinar. And I've certainly learned a lot in preparing for making today happen. And Megan's going to make a quick announcement, and then she'll put me back on to close.
Hello, everyone. Wow, that was wonderful. I really learned a lot. I hope you all did too. I just want to quickly talk about our upcoming events. So next Monday, September 21st, will be our next water webinar. And that one's called Walking the Talk, Activating for the Water. And this session is going to focus on various expressions and experiences protecting water as a shared common and a sacred gift. So we'll hope you'll join us along with Paul Baines and Tasha Beads to learn about written and experiential ways water protectors are stepping into their leadership roles. And next up after that is Watershed 2020, and this will be happening on September 26th. So not this Saturday, but the next Saturday. And this is an exciting online convention bringing together people working towards water justice in Ontario. We truly can't wait to share this with you. The convention will have 12 workshops led by community leaders on the front lines of water protection. And those are organized into 4 different streams covering decolonization, grassroots campaigns to protect water, watershed and Great Lakes protection, and strategies to fight aggregate extraction in your community. We'll also have a presentation by representatives of Ontario's political parties on water protection priorities, as well as live performances, including 3-time Juno Award nominee Alicia Brilla. Watershed 2020 is a part of the People's Water Campaign, a broad-based initiative to restore environmental protections for water security and build the movement towards water justice in Ontario. So like this webinar, it's a part of the People's Water Campaign. And Watershed 2020 will represent the end of the first phase and bring us into the second phase of the People's Water Campaign. And so we really hope that you'll be able to spend the day with us, September 26th. However, if you're not available on that day but are still interested, please do continue to register and we'll send you recordings of the entire day. That's it from me, so I'll pass it back to you, Karen. And we hope you register. The link is going to be placed in the chat box. Danny has done that, I think, already, along with the program, so you can check out the details of the day. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Megan, for that announcement. It's true, it's going to be a fabulous day. And when I think about it, I think about I'm up at a lake right now, and I'm looking out on this magnificent lake, not far from Port Severn in Georgian Bay. And you know what? Ontario's water deserves wise government. And we need to take care of it. And it can't just be about the people that are in office. We need to push and make sure that our freshwater streams and rivers and lakes are protected in Ontario, and we're not being cavalier with the number of pollutants and contaminants that we are putting in them. So thank you to all of our guests, our panelists, and for the participants. It was terrific to have you join us today. Hope to see you again. Bye.